Now, may I ask Minister Groser to offer some lessons learned from other parts of the world and to see what kind of a policy advice that you may wish to offer to the developing countries?
Well, thank you very much, James, ladies and gentlemen. I think the first question is, does this work? Does this offer our countries of different stages of development and different sizes opportunities? And I think the answer to that unquestionably is yes. I suspect that public opinion in most of our countries would regard it as slightly counterintuitive. They would think, 100% made in New Zealand or 100% made in Indonesia is by definition the optimal outcome. And I think that's probably a big mistake. First of all, recall the big figures here. According to the latest research we have available, 56% of world trade is now in intermediate goods, and 73, an astonishing 73% of world trade and services is in intermediate goods, or as Minister Pangestu said, trade and tasks. So this is a huge component of world trade. And there's another statistic that I think frames this discussion in a very intriguing way that came out of that brilliant study that UNCTAD, the ITC, the OECD, and the WTO and the ILO put together for the last ministerial meeting at the OECD, which was, in the last 20 years, the average imported content of a manufactured export has gone up from 20% of content being imported to 40%. Now, the implications of this are truly interesting. First of all, I think it works for countries large and small. I mean, the most obvious example would be to take China, the place of last manufacturing, and we just look at the success the Chinese have had in that respect. Real industrial wages have risen 250% in the first decade of the 21st century. And you all know that story about the Apple iPod and the number of countries and components that go into that. I don't think we need to repeat that well-known story. But it also can work for a small developing country, island state. And I'd like to give you the example, since it's such a contrast with China, of Western Samoa, a country that we're obviously very close to. And a practical example, which is a women in development example that I've been to see personally, and we try and help on the sides. So what they identified was, there's a company that most of you will know, recalling Minister Pangestu's point about the importance of women as purchasing agents, called The Body Shop. Mm-hmm. And The Body Shop sells to socially conscious women consumers for the most part. And they have integrated into their supply chain organically produced virgin coconut oil. And I've seen the way that village families produce this by, first of all, a very strong sustainability scheme around it to ensure that the company gets what they think they're buying. So there's quite a rigorous audit around this by local women who are in charge of the process. And the village people, they told me when I was there, could get 6 to 7 times as much for their product. Admittedly, it's higher cost producing it than the traditional way. And everybody is happy with this. So I think, we shouldn't just say participation in the global value chain is something only for very large developing countries like Indonesia and China. It is also an option for very small countries. And even in the case of my country, which I think is quite intriguing to look at, in the sense that, given that 70% of our exports are commodities, you could say, in a way, that New Zealand is structurally more closely aligned to a developing country, but with the income levels of a developed country. We too have tried to integrate ourselves into the global value chain with differing experiences. First of all, what we've discovered is it's very important to distinguish between adding value and adding cost. It's all very well to think that further processing by definition means more jobs, but actually you have to have a rather more scientific approach to that. And I've been working in New Zealand at home with some of our forestry companies, which are internationally competitive at the upstream end of the global value chain, in trying to identify bits downstream that they could participate in that don't just add costs but add value. So that's something worth reflecting on. Secondly, if you want to participate, you've got to establish connectivity within your own country. And this starts with basic hard infrastructure around things like roading systems. And let me commend, by the way, for those of you who haven't read it, I picked this up from the ITC table yesterday and read it late yesterday afternoon on exactly this applied to mainly sub-Saharan African countries, of which 36 have made very substantial progress, according to this report, in upgrading their participation in the value chain through further processing. But establishing good roads is fundamental to it. Beyond that, there's the question of internet access. This is particularly important in the world of the global value chain applied to services. And if I can use my own country as an example, we've discovered only very recently that we thought we were rather commoditized at the low end of services exports. But now we find we're doing rather better than that. You mentioned, Murray, the film industry. Well, we've had success in that through Lord of the Rings would be the most obvious example, and we're just about to start production of The Hobbit. And just as you were doing Hollywood and Korea last week, my chief salesman, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was in Hollywood also last week, trying to encourage them to invest further in film production. And we've found that high-end commercial services, of which things like legal firms, architectural services, they're all part of this services global value chain, and they depend critically on infrastructure. Well, the infrastructure for them, of course, is the internet. 85% of our services exports are delivered down the internet. So whether it's old-fashioned hard infrastructure such as adequate roads to connect your producers to the ports, or modern infrastructure, the superhighways of the 21st century, that's something very important for all of our economies to focus on if you want to profit from participation in the value chain. And I think, going back to my theme about the importance of distinguishing between adding value and just adding cost, you've got to have a sustained focus on productivity, no matter what stage of development your economy is in. You've got to make sure that you are actually reducing compliance costs, that you're integrating into the global system of standards, which is becoming more and more. I mean, it's a whole other topic, James, I could go into around international standards and how it feeds into the global value chain. But I think to sum up, look, it's not a new phenomenon. I remember when I was studying economics more decades ago than I care to admit, that, we talked about trade in intermediate goods. But the dimension of it has grown in the last 25 years, so much so that in a metaphorical sense, one can consider this to be a new phenomenon, which is not strictly true. And I think it puts forward a whole series of challenges. But at the end of the day, I take an optimistic view of this, particularly from the perspective of small economies. I mean, you think of the Samoan example I give you. There's not a remote chance of a country of that size, which is a population of about 220,000 people, establishing an internationally competitive pharmaceutical company. Not a chance. But by participating in the global value chain of one of those giant companies, they can participate in that system. Equally for New Zealand, there is not a chance, we were talking about this in the room before, of a country of my size, 4.5 million, establishing a globally competitive motor vehicle industry. But we can, and we do, produce components, all for export, and get into the value chain. So I think the growth of the value chain is not a defeatist concept, James, for small countries, whether they are small developed or small developing or emerging economies. I think it's actually, at the end of the day, a big opportunity, but you've got to get your costs right, you've got to get your productivity under control, and you've got to identify where you sit in the global value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Groser. Indeed, that you emphasized some important points, emphasizing the important opportunities for small economies and also talking about productivity, which is very important.